Hey guys, go ahead and dim the lights. Pull up that blanket you definitely overpaid for on Etsy. Get your pillow into the one position you'll keep flipping back to all night. And just breathe. Tonight we're gliding back to early medieval Europe, which honestly was less castles and dragons and more lice, questionable hygiene, and royals acting like toddlers with swords. Perfect bedtime material. So, the star of our cozy little descent into dynastic dysfunction is Fredegund of Neustria. You might not have heard of her, which is probably because she lived in that strange middle patch of history, the Merovingian dynasty. That's the ruling family in what's now basically France, before the Carolingians and Charlemagne came along and did the whole Holy Roman Emperor thing. The Merovingians were like the discount royal family, dramatic, scandalous, and just competent enough to keep limping forward for about 300 years. Fredegund herself is one of those figures who, if she lived today, would absolutely be banned from every PTA meeting. Imagine a woman so ruthlessly ambitious that she clawed her way up from being a servant girl, became queen, and then allegedly seduced her own stepsons. Yeah, that's the bedtime story we're starting with. But let's not rush. Let's just ease into her world, sip on the royal gossip, and drift through this wonderfully terrible family. So first things first, Fredegund did not come from power. She was originally a low-born servant in the household of Chilperic III, King of Neustria. Picture her cleaning goblets or folding bed linens while nobles stomped around in itchy furs. But somehow, and you can imagine the various somehows available to a clever servant in a royal household, she caught the king's eye. Now Chilperic Guy was not exactly France's greatest king. He had the vibes of that one cousin who insists he's starting a business, but just spends most of his time complaining on Facebook. He was ambitious, sure, but in a sort of sloppy soap opera way. He wanted land, he wanted wives, he wanted attention, and Fredegund quickly figured out how to supply at least one of those things. The problem was, Chilperic was already married, twice. His first wife was Audovera, who gave him several children. The second was Galswinter, who was, fun detail, the sister of Brunhilde, another very famous and terrifying queen. Galswinter was basically imported from Visigothic Spain in a high-end diplomatic marriage deal. Except Chilperic, being Chilperic, decided he didn't like her that much after all. Though, of course, he had her strangled, because why work through marital issues when you can just not? And that's where Fredegund slid in. With Galswinter conveniently out of the way, she became queen. So far, so medieval, but Fredegund wasn't. Content to just wear nice crowns and glare at courtiers. She went full Shakespeare villain. She maneuvered, she schemed, and she got her rivals killed with the kind of efficiency that would have impressed a crime boss. She's remembered as one of the most ruthless women of the early Middle Ages. And honestly, that's saying something when your competition includes Brunhilde, who once had someone executed by being tied to a wild horse. Fredegund's reputation came not just from murder and political scheming, but also from what medieval chroniclers described as her immoral behavior, which is the polite monk way of saying she was sleeping with people she really should not have been sleeping with. Let's pause here for the vibe. We're talking about a world where arranged marriages were political weapons and most royal. Spouses weren't even on speaking terms. Adultery. It was basically a full-time hobby. But Fredegund took it a step further because, according to some sources, she seduced her own stepsons. Yes, the children of her husband. If you're all ready, clutching your pillow tighter, don't worry. It's less salacious than it sounds and more deeply uncomfortable in a "why are humans like this" sort of way. The chroniclers disagree on which stepsons she targeted. Some point to Merovec, one of Chilperic's older sons. Merovec was ambitious, rebellious, and had the misfortune of being named something that sounds like a low-rent dragon from Dungeons and Dragons. He and Fredegund apparently had an arrangement, though whether it was real passion or just political maneuvering is hard to tell. Other reports suggest she also had dalliances with other stepsons, because why stop at one? Now, before you picture this as a medieval romance novel, remember, the sources we have come mostly from hostile chroniclers, especially Gregory of Tours, who was basically the gossip blogger of his day. He loathed Fredegund, and he wrote about her with the enthusiasm of someone exposing the Kardashians. So did she really sleep with her stepsons? Maybe. Did Gregory enjoy telling everyone she did? Absolutely. But the rumors fit her pattern. Fredegund's entire life was about climbing ladders she wasn't supposed to touch. She married up, she schemed up, she seduced up, and she had no problem playing every possible side if it meant getting what she wanted. Even if what she wanted involved scandalizing the royal court by cozying up to her husband's children. So let's float for a moment into the larger Merovingian family drama, because it makes a lot more sense when you see the mess around. Her Chilperic, her husband, had multiple kids from multiple wives. This meant the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled ball of yarn after your cat's been at it. Each son wanted power. Each son had claims. And Fredegund's own children, the ones she had with Chilperic, were just more pieces in the game. She wanted them to survive and preferably inherit everything, which meant the older sons, they were problems, potential rivals, obstacles. So, one way to deal with obstacles is to murder them, which Fredegund allegedly did, quite liberally. Another way, apparently, was to seduce them, destabilize their loyalties, and then let them self-destruct. Merovec, the stepson most often tied to her, ended up rebelling against his father, allying with Brunhilde, and generally making a mess of things. Was that Fredegund's influence? Maybe. Or maybe he just inherited his dad's talent for bad decisions. Either way, Merovec's rebellion ended with him dead. He was forced to commit suicide while trapped in a church. Not the fairy tale ending, but again very on-brand for this dynasty. And through all of this, Fredegund kept her grip on power. Chilperic himself eventually got assassinated, because again, that's what happened when you annoyed enough people in the Merovingian world. But Fredegund? She survived. She became regent for her son, Clothar II, and managed to keep her family's throne warm, despite being surrounded by enemies. Imagine it. A former servant girl, accused of killing queens, murdering rivals, and sleeping with stepsons, ended up being one of the most powerful figures in early medieval France. And she did it without Instagram followers or a podcast, just pure, uncut ambition. Now you might be wondering, what did she look like? Was she a dazzling beauty seducing everyone with her charm, or was she just terrifying enough that people went along with it? Unfortunately, medieval chroniclers rarely give us helpful Tinder profiles. Gregory of Tours, again being shady, described her as cunning and ruthless, but didn't really dwell on her looks, which, given Gregory's flair for dramatic insults, probably means she was at least average. If she'd been hideous, he would have said so. If she'd been stunning, he would have said that too, but with more passive aggression. Instead, Fredegund's legacy is built almost entirely on scandal. She became the archetype of the evil medieval queen, the type who poisons her enemies, betrays her family, and still comes out on top, which, if you're trying to fall asleep, is actually kind of comforting. Because no matter how much you've embarrassed yourself this week, at least you're not remembered for possibly seducing your husband's children and murdering a bunch of people. So that's our starting point. Fredegund, the servant-turned-queen, accused poisoner, maybe stepmother lover and survivor of one of history's messiest royal soap operas. But of course she wasn't alone in the hall of dysfunction. Medieval and early modern Europe is littered with royals who thought family boundaries were optional and marriage vows were basically suggestions. So, as we drift further, let's leave Fredegund polishing her poisoned goblets and move quietly over to some of her royal colleagues in bad decision-making. Because she may have been the queen who scandalized her stepsons, but she was far from the only aristocrat who redefined the word inappropriate. And that's where we'll float next. Brunhilde and the eternal family feud all right. We've left Fredegund lounging in her poison-scented boudoir, and now we drift across the battlefield to meet her greatest enemy. If Fredegund was the ruthless soap opera villain, then Brunhilde of Austrasia was, well, the ruthless soap opera villainess in the other plotline. These two queens basically spent decades throwing knives, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, at each other. It's one of those long, exhausting rivalries that makes you wonder if either of them ever took a day off. Spoiler, they did not. So who was Brunhilde? She was a Visigothic princess, imported from Spain like a very fancy diplomatic package. Her sister was Galswintha, remember her? The unlucky queen who got strangled by Chilperic so he could be with Fredegund. Yes, that Galswintha. So Brunhilde came into Gaul already with family drama waiting at customs. She married Sigebert I, the king of Austrasia, which was another chunk of what we'd now call France and Germany. Sigebert was Chilperic's brother, which means, yes, we're dealing with brothers married to sisters, which means when one of those sisters got murdered, Galswintha, the other one, Brunhilde, was not exactly sending Christmas cards to her brother-in-law and his new wife, Fredegund. And so began the feud. Sigebert, to his credit, seemed like he might actually have been a semi-decent husband, which is honestly rare for this dynasty. He and Brunhilde had kids, ran their kingdom, and tried to play the political chessboard, except every chess move was basically, should we murder Chilperic today, or should we wait until he murders someone else first? The problem is that Sigebert made the classic Merovingian mistake of being competent. He won battles, he gained prestige, his nobles respected him, which meant he had the survival expectancy of a housefly in Fredegund's kitchen. And sure enough, when Sigebert started to actually gain the upper hand against his brother, Fredegund arranged for him to be assassinated. How? With two men carrying poisoned daggers. Because apparently poison wasn't stylish enough anymore, and regular stabbing wasn't subtle enough either, so why not mash the two together? Sigebert dropped dead, and Brunhilde was suddenly widowed. Now here's the part where most medieval queens would have quietly retired to a convent, spent their days praying, and occasionally complaining about arthritis. But not Brunhilde. She doubled down. She stayed in Austrasia and acted as regent for her sons. She tried to maintain power, balance alliances, and keep her family afloat while Fredegund was gleefully trying to saw the ladder out from under her. The result? A decades-long feud between these two women that basically defined Merovingian politics. Armies marched, assassinations happened. Everyone switched sides at least 3 times. It was less Game of Thrones and more endless office drama, but with swords. Let's pause for a moment on the tone of this rivalry. Imagine two women who absolutely despised each other. Fredegund was the scrappy social climber, clawing her way up from servant status. Brunhilde was the royal-born princess, with all the dignity and arrogance that implied. Each of them believed the other was a threat to their children's inheritance, and neither of them was wrong. So they spent 40 years, yes, 4 decades, trying to outlast, outwit, and outmurder each other. And because they were both stubborn, ambitious, and fairly ruthless, neither of them ever really won. They just kept ruining everything around them. Brunhilde, to her credit, was not just about scheming. She also did some actual governance. She reorganized administration, pushed for roads and infrastructure, and even tried to improve royal authority over the nobility, which you know sounds very progressive, except her nobles hated it. They preferred kings and queens who were incompetent because then they could do whatever they wanted. And Brunhilde, well, she wasn't incompetent. She was also not exactly nice, which meant her nobles tolerated her about as much as a teenager tolerates chores. She also had the bad habit of marrying into her enemies. At one point, she arranged to marry Chilperic's son Merovec. Yes, the same Merovec who may or may not have been involved with Fredegund. That marriage went about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, it turned into chaos, and Merovec ended up dead. Honestly, the Merovingian princes were like those guys in horror movies who wander into the basement when the lights are out. You want to yell, "Don't do it," but they always do, and they always get metaphorically or literally stabbed. Now, while Fredegund died in 597, Brunhilde kept going. She lived into her 70s, which for the early Middle Ages is basically Methuselah levels. But of course it wouldn't be a royal biography without a grim, ironic ending. By the time she was old and grey, Brunhilde had outlived most of her enemies. But she'd also alienated almost everyone still alive. Her attempts to control her grandsons, her endless meddling in politics, and her reputation for scheming made her deeply unpopular. Eventually, she was captured by Clothar II, Fredegund's son, who grew up hearing bedtime stories about what a nightmare Brunhilde was. And let's just say he didn't exactly offer her tea and biscuits. Instead, she was executed in a way that even medieval chroniclers thought was a bit much. She was tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged to death. Yes, after 70 years of political maneuvering, that's how it ended. So, to recap this slow-motion train wreck, Fredegund, the servant girl, murders, schemes, maybe seduces her stepsons, and becomes queen. Brunhilde, the Visigothic princess, fights back, governs a kingdom, and ends up horse-dragged at age 70. Their feud spans decades and leaves a trail of corpses, orphans, and very tired nobles. And together they embody everything that made the Merovingians such a delightful mess. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, for one, it shows how much power queens could actually wield in the early Middle Ages. We often imagine medieval queens as passive pawns, married off for treaties and forgotten. But Fredegund and Brunhilde were proof that, given enough ambition and a few conveniently poisoned daggers, a queen could shape politics just as much as a king. Also, it's just kind of funny in a bleak way. These two women spent their lives fighting, only for their children and grandchildren to keep feuding anyway. Nothing got solved. Everyone ended up worse off. It was like dedicating your entire career to winning. A board game, only to have the dog knock the board over at the end. And if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just floated through half a century of murder, scandal, and royal pettiness without once needing to Google who's related to whom. But let's keep gliding. Because as messy as the Merovingians were, they're not the only dynasty worth gossiping about. If you like inbreeding, fragile chins, and monarchs who could barely chew their dinner, you're going to love the Habsburgs. So let's drift on, softly, towards Spain, Austria, and one of the most famously unfortunate family trees in all of history. The Habsburg jaw and other genetic nightmares. All right, let's tuck away the poisoned daggers and galloping horses for now. We're leaving the Merovingians behind and drifting forward in time, across the Alps into the world of the Habsburgs. Now, if the Merovingians were famous for chaos, the Habsburgs were famous for not leaving the family reunion, ever. Their whole dynasty was basically one long group project in endogamy, and the results were exactly what you'd expect when your family tree is less a tree and more a circle. Yes, we're talking about the infamous Habsburg jaw. So, what was the Habsburg jaw? In the simplest terms, it was a genetic condition called mandibular prognathism. That's the sciencey way of saying your lower jaw sticks out way too far. Combine that with an underbite you could drive a carriage through, and you've got the royal look that made portraits of the Habsburgs look like they were constantly confused about how biting worked. This wasn't just a little quirk, like a pointy nose or a widow's peak. We're talking serious medical issues. Many Habsburgs had trouble chewing, swallowing, and even speaking clearly. Their faces were so noticeably deformed that chroniclers and ambassadors commented on it constantly. Imagine being introduced at court and the first thing anyone writes home about is, yes, she seemed pleasant, but her jaw. How did this happen? Simple. The Habsburgs were so obsessed with keeping their royal bloodlines pure that they just kept marrying cousins, over and over, for centuries. See, the Habsburg strategy for power wasn't about conquering with armies, it was about conquering with weddings. Their motto might as well have been, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Which sounds charming until you realize it meant brothers marrying nieces, uncles marrying great-nieces, and cousins marrying other cousins. For a few generations this worked. The Habsburgs got land in Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and pretty much half of Europe just by signing marriage contracts. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, the inbreeding caught up with them. Hard. Let's take a sleepy stroll through a few of the greatest hits. First, there was Philip II of Spain. He's the guy best remembered for sending the Spanish Armada against Elizabeth the Friar of England in 1588, which ended with ships sinking, storms raging, and Philip sulking in Madrid. But physically, he was already showing signs of that famous Habsburg look. He had the protruding jaw, droopy lower lip, and that odd facial length that made him look like he'd been stretched out slightly in Photoshop. Then came his descendants. Each generation, the jaw got a little longer, the underbite a little worse. It was like watching a caricature artist go to town, except it was nature doing the sketching. By the time we get to Charles II of Spain, oh boy, Charles is the poster child of Habsburg inbreeding, and conveniently also the tragic bedtime mascot for why marrying your niece is never a good genetic strategy. Charles II, sometimes called El Hechizado or the Bewitched, ruled Spain in the late 17th century. He's often described as one of the most physically and mentally disabled monarchs in history, which, you know, is a polite way of saying the poor guy was a complete medical disaster from birth. His jaw was so pronounced, he could barely chew food. His tongue was so oversized, he had trouble speaking. He was sick constantly, frail, and never developed normally. Court doctors wrote endless reports about his health, many of them sounding more like horror stories than medical notes. And of course he was infertile, which meant after all those centuries of cousin marriage designed to preserve the dynasty, the Habsburgs ended up with a king who couldn't produce an heir. Irony really outdid itself here. Charles's death in 1700 without children officially ended the Spanish Habsburg line, which triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, basically Europe's messy divorce court. But honestly, the real tragedy is that the dynasty had tied itself into such a genetic knot that the outcome was inevitable. Let's pause for a bedtime image. Imagine a giant tapestry in a drafty castle hall with all the Habsburg faces lined up. Each generation, the chins get longer, the lips droop lower, and the faces narrow. By the end, it looks like someone was photocopying a jawline and kept hitting the enlarge button by mistake. That's centuries of inbreeding rendered in thread, and yet, despite how obvious the problem was, the Habsburgs just kept doing it, because marrying your cousin seemed safer politically than letting some random outsider into the bloodline. Which is fair if your top priority is holding on to land, less fair if your top priority is chewing. Now, to be kind, the Habsburgs weren't alone. Most royal families dabbled in inbreeding, but the Habsburgs were just really committed, if there, were an Olympic event for cousin marriage, they'd have taken the gold every century. It wasn't just Spain either. The Austrian branch had plenty of jaw action too. Though because they mixed things up a little more with outside marriages, they dodged the full Charles II catastrophe. But still, you can look at portraits of Leopold I, for example, and it's clear the family genes were doing something. He had that elongated face and drooping lip that made him look perpetually surprised and slightly damp. Here's where the irony sets in, and it's the perfect sleepy thought. The Habsburgs gained half of Europe by being cautious and insular, but by doing so, they basically bred themselves into extinction. Their whole no outsiders allowed policy eventually backfired. It's the royal equivalent of hoarding snacks in your room and then realizing all of them expired 3 years ago. But the Habsburg jaw is just one of many genetic oddities that show up in royal history. Because when you only ever marry within the same 10 families, you don't just get bad jaws, you get hemophilia, madness, infertility, and a whole buffet of hereditary misfortunes. And since we're already drifting in that direction, let's float gently into another dynasty that couldn't keep its DNA straight, the Bourbons. Spoiler, their story involves more fragile bloodlines and another dose of why do royals never learn? Bourbon fragility, and the curse of hemophilia. Okay. We've floated through the Merovingian soap opera, admired the Habsburgs chewing their way into oblivion, and now we sail softly into Bourbon territory. And if the Habsburg jaw was a problem of bones and faces, the Bourbons carried around a different curse. Fragile blood. We're talking about hemophilia. Hemophilia is one of those conditions that's awful in any family, but in a royal family it's a full-blown dynastic crisis. Why? Because hemophilia is genetic, incurable in those days, and makes you bleed far too easily. Even a small injury could be life-threatening, which is not ideal when you're supposed to be leading armies, riding horses, or even just surviving childhood. In an era where safety meant not immediately poking yourself on something rusty. So how did hemophilia crash the Bourbon party? The real kicker is that it didn't actually start in the Bourbons. It came via intermarriage. The condition is usually traced back in royal circles to Queen Victoria of Britain, who passed it down like an unwanted party favor across Europe's dynasties in the 19th century. But the Bourbons already had a reputation for fragility long before. Even without hemophilia, their kids had a tendency to die young, fall sick constantly, or just generally wilt. Being a Bourbon child was a bit like being one of those delicate houseplants. Looks fancy, doesn't last. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King. The man himself lived to a shockingly old age, 76, which is basically 3 lifetimes in the 17th century, but his children, not so lucky. He had a staggering number of kids, both legitimate and illegitimate, but most of the legitimate ones died young. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, you name it, they had it. It's grim bedtime trivia, but the line of succession under Louis XIV looked like a bowling alley. Each time you thought the heir was secure, strike down he goes. His son died, his grandson died, even his great-grandson died. By the time Louis XIV finally expired himself in 1715, the crown ended up on the head of his 5-year-old great-great-grandson, which, you know, is not exactly the stable dynasty vibe you want after 70 years of pomp and Versailles fountains. But hemophilia specifically becomes a big Bourbon problem later, with the Spanish branch. Remember Charles II, our Habsburg disaster? When he died heirless in 1700, the crown of Spain passed to the Bourbons, thanks to his will and some very complicated family bargaining. So the French Bourbons took over Spain, becoming the Spanish Bourbons. And of course, they brought along their own medical misfortunes. Over the centuries, through more intermarriage, because of course, the Bourbons ended up tangled in the web of hemophilia carriers. By the 19th century, Spanish princes were being born with the condition, adding yet another layer of fragility to a dynasty already famous for looking glamorous while quietly collapsing inside. And hemophilia didn't just hit the Bourbons. It turned up in the Romanovs of Russia too, thanks again to Queen Victoria's descendants. Nicholas II's only son, Alexei, had the disease, and it became one of the great vulnerabilities of the Russian Empire. But we'll drift to Russia a little later. For now, let's linger in France, because there's no shortage of Bourbon tragedies to lull you into sleep. One of the more tragic Bourbon figures is Louis XVII. Technically, he never reigned, but he's remembered as the Lost Dauphin. He was the son of Louis XVIII and Marie Antoinette, the famous let-them-eat-cake duo who lost their heads in the French Revolution. When his parents were executed, little Louis was just 8 years old. Revolutionaries locked him in a cell in the Temple prison in Paris, and there he wasted away. He wasn't executed like his parents. Instead, he died slowly of neglect, disease, and probably malnutrition in 1795. He was 10. It's one of those stories where you expect some dramatic rescue, but no. The monarchy was collapsing, revolutionaries were paranoid, and the boy was just quietly forgotten. His body was dumped in a mass grave. Decades later, rumors spread that he'd actually survived and escaped, leading to a whole wave of false dauphins popping up across Europe. But the real child, long gone, not hemophilia this time, just plain cold neglect. But it fits the Bourbon pattern. Fragile heirs, tragic children, dynasties clinging by a thread. And then, of course, there's Louis XVI himself. Let's be honest, he wasn't exactly the poster boy of Bourbon health either. Awkward, indecisive, prone to melancholy. He spent years struggling with what might have been a mild case of phimosis, which, let's keep this sleepy and polite, meant his marriage with Marie Antoinette went unconsummated for a long time, which naturally gave the gossip mills of Versailles a decade's worth of material. Combine that with his poor political instincts, his weak stomach for confrontation, and his tendency to tinker with locks instead of running the kingdom. And you've got a monarch who was basically born to be steamrolled by history. If we step back and look at the Bourbons as a whole, you start to see the same pattern we saw with the Habsburgs. Inbreeding fragile children, and the kind of genetic bad luck that made it feel like nature itself was tired of their dynasties. The difference is that the Bourbons went out in style. Palaces, masquerades, operas, fountains, Versailles glittered while their heirs withered. It's like watching someone host the best dinner party of the century while quietly knowing they maxed out their credit card and the repo man is waiting outside. So the Bourbons, fragile bloodlines, and hemophilia. Another dynasty where medical misfortune became political catastrophe. But before you drift off completely, let's wander further east, because no bedtime tour of dynastic dysfunction would be complete without stopping in Russia. The Romanovs were the masters of looking imposing in portraits, while privately being absolute disasters. And if you like hemophilia, mystics, and tragic royal children, oh, you're going to love Rasputin. Let's float that way next. The Romanovs. Rasputin and the bleeding Prince All Right. We've drifted through France, admired fragile Bourbon princes, and now the wind carries us into Russia. Big palaces, bigger beards, and dynastic chaos on ice. The Romanovs ruled Russia from the early 1600s right up until 1917, when revolution politely, or not so politely, asked them to step aside forever. They gave us czars, empresses, and, of course, that family portrait everyone knows, where half of them look exhausted and the other half look like they'd rather be anywhere else. But the figure who really embodies the Romanov decline is Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Nicholas II and Alexandra. Alexei was the heir to the Russian throne, and like so many royals before him, he inherited a medical curse. Yes, We're back to hemophilia. Alexei was born in 1904, and for Nicholas and Alexandra, he was a miracle. They'd already had 4 daughters, and while the girls were charming enough, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, Russia was still clinging to the whole only a male heir counts thing. So when Alexei arrived, bells rang, cannons fired, and Nicholas probably wept tears of relief into his moustache. But the joy didn't last. Very soon it became clear that Alexei was fragile, really fragile. A small bruise would swell alarmingly. A minor cut might bleed uncontrollably. He couldn't roughhouse, couldn't ride freely, couldn't do much of anything without his parents panicking. The truth was simple. He had hemophilia, inherited from his mother Alexandra, who carried the gene through her grandmother Queen Victoria. Yet again, Victoria's DNA was causing royal dynasties to collapse in the most inconvenient ways possible. Now, imagine being the imperial family of Russia in the early 20th century. You've got an empire sprawling across 11 time zones. You've got political unrest bubbling everywhere, and your one heir, the future Tsar, could die from a nosebleed. The secrecy was intense. The Romanovs didn't want Russia or Europe to know that the heir was fragile, so they tried to hide it. They whisked Alexei out of sight when he had flare-ups. They downplayed his illnesses, but word always leaks, especially in palaces where every servant is basically a walking gossip column. And this is where Rasputin enters stage left, dragging his mystic reputation behind him like an unwashed cloak. Grigory Rasputin was a wandering Siberian holy man, part monk, part mystic, part professional creep. He somehow slithered into St. Petersburg high society and charmed his way into the Romanovs' inner circle. Why? Because when Alexei had life-threatening bleeding episodes, Rasputin seemed to help. Now, historians still debate whether Rasputin actually did anything miraculous, or whether he just happened to arrive at moments when Alexei was naturally recovering. Some suggest that his calming presence lowered Alexandra's hysteria, which in turn lowered Alexei's stress, which actually did help his condition. Others say Rasputin simply told the doctors to stop stuffing the boy with aspirin, which thins blood and made everything worse. So in that sense, Rasputin might have saved Alexei by doing the radical medical intervention of nothing. Either way, the imperial couple believed Rasputin had healing powers. And once you convince a desperate mother that you alone can save her only son, congratulations, you now run Russia. Let's picture Rasputin for a moment. Tall, scruffy, wild eyes, questionable hygiene. He looked less like a holy man and more like someone you'd cross the street to avoid. But Alexandra was convinced he was divinely chosen. Nicholas, ever the passive husband, went along with it. So Rasputin became their trusted advisor, which went over about as well with the Russian nobility as you'd expect. They despised him. Rumors spread that he was sleeping with the Empress, or with her daughters, or with half of St. Petersburg. Honestly, if you believed the gossip, Rasputin was single-handedly running an empire and an Olympic-level sex life at the same time. Most of it was slander. But Rasputin did wield influence, enough that ministers feared him, courtiers whispered constantly, and Russia's political elite saw him as a symbol of the monarchy's decay. Meanwhile, poor Alexei continued to suffer. His condition never improved. One particularly grim episode in 1912 left him bleeding internally from a carriage accident. Doctors prepared for his death. Alexandra prayed. Rasputin sent a telegram assuring them that the little one will not die. And against all odds, Alexei recovered. Moments like that sealed Rasputin's grip on the family. Alexandra was convinced God had sent him. And Nicholas, already indecisive about everything from Duma reforms to breakfast, wasn't going to argue. But Alexei's fragility meant Russia had no secure heir. Everyone knew that if Nicholas died or abdicated, the monarchy was perched on quicksand. That vulnerability, paired with World War I, food shortages and general incompetence, helped crack the empire apart. Of course, the end came in 1917. The Romanovs were toppled, Nicholas abdicated, and the family was eventually executed in 1918. Alexei, just 13, was carried down to the cellar in Yekaterinburg with his sisters and parents. His hemophilia hadn't killed him yet, but history was about to. It's a grim note, but if you're nodding off, just let it wash by softly. A dynasty of beards and palaces undone by fragile blood and too much trust in one mystic with terrible bathing habits. So, to recap, the Romanov lullaby, the heir Alexei had hemophilia. Rasputin waltzed in and convinced the family he could heal him. The court hated Rasputin, but the Tsar and Tsarina clung to him. The empire unraveled anyway, and once again, hemophilia managed to wreck a dynasty, just as it had with the Bourbons and others. Dynastic fragility, family secrets, and a mystic with questionable and a fashion sense. That's Russia in a nutshell. But before you drift off completely, let's float gently onward. Because Europe wasn't the only place where royals were falling apart. Over in England, we've got plenty of fragile children, dysfunctional marriages, and kings who honestly should have been sent on long vacations instead of given crowns. So, next we'll drift into England's sad, sickly monarchs, the Tudors, the Stuarts, and a few Georges who definitely needed therapy more than thrones. England's sad and sickly monarchs, all right. We've tucked away the Romanovs and their bleeding prince. Now we float across the channel to England, where the kings and queens weren't exactly the picture of health either. If anything, they were a revolving door of fragile children, moody adults, and monarchs who seemed to think ruling was just a side hobby next to sulking, fainting, or going quietly mad. England's royal tradition is basically a family diary of why are we like this? And if you line them up one by one, the sheer amount of physical and mental fragility makes you wonder how the monarchy survived at all. Let's start with the Tudors. They're usually remembered as glamorous. Henry VIII strutting about in wide-shouldered armor, Elizabeth I ruling with fire and speeches. But peel back the pageantry, and the family was a medical disaster zone. Take Edward VI, Henry VIII's only legitimate son. Henry spent years divorcing, beheading, and generally tormenting women in search of a male heir. And when he finally got one, Edward, the boy, was a fragile reed in the wind. Born in 1537, Edward was delicate from the start. He did make it to the throne at age 9, after Henry's bloated exit from history. But Edward was always sick, pale, coughing, weak. He ruled through regents, because obviously a child wasn't going to manage Parliament himself. And just as Henry must have feared in his worst nightmares, Edward died at 15. Most likely from tuberculosis, though some historians suggest pneumonia, measles, or a combo platter of infections. So Henry tore England apart for years chasing a male heir, only for the heir to be too frail to survive. Irony, thy name is Tudor, then there's Mary Fye, Edward's half-sister. Bloody Mary. But behind the ominous nickname, Mary herself was another royal fragility case. She suffered from chronic illnesses her whole life, and her reign is most remembered for her tragic phantom pregnancies. Twice, Mary thought she was pregnant. She showed symptoms. Her belly swelled. The court prepared for an heir. And twice, nothing. Likely cysts, or perhaps severe dropsy. What we'd now call edema. For her, it was humiliating. For her dynasty, it was devastating. And for historians, it's yet another reminder that royal bodies often failed at the one job expected of them, reproducing heirs. She died at 42, probably of ovarian cancer or uterine tumors. So again, another Tudor undone not by assassins or wars, but by their own body quietly giving up. And Elizabeth the Fair, she's remembered as Gloriana, the strong, eternal Virgin Queen, but she too had her frailties. Smallpox nearly killed her. In 1562, leaving her with scars she covered with heavy makeup for the rest of her life. In her later years, she suffered hair loss, tooth decay, and the emotional toll of ruling alone. By the end, she was frail, melancholy, and often lost in thought, staring at walls for hours. Not exactly the Hollywood version of Elizabeth, but very human. So that's the Tudors, outwardly strong, inwardly fragile. Which brings us to the Stuarts, who took fragility to new, often bizarre levels. James I of England, also James VI of Scotland, was the dynasty's starter king. Smart, sure, but physically awkward. He had weak legs, drooled constantly, and was terrified of knives. Which, to be fair, is a reasonable phobia in a palace, but less so if you're supposed to look majestic. His son, Charles, didn't exactly win the genetic lottery either. Short, stammering, with a speech impediment that plagued him for life. He overcompensated with pride and rigidity, qualities that eventually got him executed. But beneath the pomp, he was a man fighting against his own insecurities. Then comes Charles II, tall, charming, full of wit. But physically, he had a habit of sudden fainting spells and may have had a neurological disorder. His court called him the Merry Monarch, but behind the merriment he was often exhausted, shaky and unwell. When he died, doctors found his brain twice the normal size and his lungs filled with fluid. Not exactly merry, but perhaps the saddest Stuart case is Queen Anne. Poor Anne. She reigned from 1702 to 1714 and personally embodied the tragedy of royal reproduction. She was pregnant 17 times. 17. Of those, only 5 children were born alive, and of those, none survived to adulthood. Her longest-lived child, William, Duke of Gloucester, died at 11 from hydrocephalus, a build-up of fluid in the brain. By the time Anne reached her 40s, she was obese, crippled by gout, and emotionally devastated. She could barely walk, had to be carried to Parliament, and lived with the grief of losing child after child. Portraits show her looking regal in her coronation robes, but the reality was a woman broken by endless miscarriages and stillbirths. When she died in 1714, the Stuart dynasty died with her, not because of assassinations or war, but because her body simply couldn't produce a surviving heir. Then the Hanoverians arrived, imported from Germany like emergency stand-ins, and they brought their own dysfunction. George III is the most famous case. Popularly remembered as the Mad King, George actually suffered from a disease we now think was porphyria, a rare blood disorder. His symptoms included violent stomach pain, blue urine, confusion, and yes, bouts of madness. During his breakdowns, he would babble endlessly, sometimes for hours. He once shook hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. He lost his sight, his hearing, and eventually his sanity altogether. By the end, his son was ruling as regent, while George lived out his days in seclusion. But the saddest part, George wasn't a bad man. He was conscientious, family-oriented, and genuinely wanted to do his job well. But his own body betrayed him, turning him into a symbol of decline. And finally, let's tiptoe to George IV. Not mad, just miserable. Obese, gout-ridden, and addicted to alcohol, George V spent most of his reign waddling between dinners and mistresses. By his 50s, he was grotesquely bloated, needed help dressing himself, and wheezed through public appearances. The people called him the Prince of Wales, which, while cruel, does sum it up. So across the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the Hanoverians, what do we see? A pattern of fragile bodies and troubled minds. Monarchs undone not by foreign enemies, but by weak lungs, bad genes, phantom pregnancies, and nervous collapses, which, in a way, is oddly comforting. Because for all their crowns and palaces, they were just as breakable as the rest of us. Now, let's float gently onward. Because if you think English monarchs were fragile, wait until you meet the children of European courts, the sad little princes and princesses who barely had a chance to survive in an era where every royal nursery doubled as a death trap. That's where we'll drift next, sad, sickly and spoiled, a guide to royal children all right. We've wandered through kings and queens with gout, madness and phantom pregnancies. Now let's peek behind the gilded nursery doors, because honestly, royal children were some of the most tragic figures of all. They were born into luxury, yes, but also into suffocating dynastic pressure, questionable medical care, and households, where being the spare usually meant you were expendable. Forget fairy tales. Royal childhoods were less frolicking in the palace gardens and more try not to die before your first birthday, or your parents will just name the next. Maybe the same thing and pretend you never existed. Let's start with the Habsburgs. Of course the Habsburgs, because when you've got centuries of inbreeding, you get children who arrive already stacked against the odds. Take Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He wasn't really a child when he earned that nickname, but his entire life was essentially one long childhood illness. Born in 1661, Charles had so many genetic issues from Habsburg inbreeding that it's honestly a miracle he survived infancy at all. He couldn't walk properly until he was about 8. He couldn't speak clearly until much later. He drooled. He constantly had seizures and was described by ambassadors as looking like a half-witted child, well into adulthood. Charles's childhood wasn't filled with tutors and play. It was filled with priests performing exorcisms because people literally thought he was cursed. By the time he grew into adulthood, he still looked and acted like a child, weak, sickly, and utterly incapable of ruling. Which, of course, plunged Spain into crisis when he died without heirs. Now, over in France, the royal nursery was practically a graveyard. Infant mortality was brutal everywhere in the 16th and 17th centuries, but the French court managed to turn it into an art form. Take the children of Louis XIV, the Sun King. He had 6 legitimate children with his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain. Of those 6, only 1 survived to adulthood, just 1. The rest died young, usually from fevers, smallpox or measles. And Louis barely seemed to notice. He just kept producing illegitimate children on the side, many of whom outlived his legitimate heirs. It says a lot when your mistress's kids are sturdier than your queen's. His only surviving legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, did grow up. But he was dull, sickly, and indecisive, nicknamed Monseigneur, as if his entire personality was just existing as the heir. He died at 49, but not before losing 2 of his own sons to smallpox. The Bourbon nursery was basically cursed. The English royal nurseries weren't much better. We already touched on Queen Anne's 17 pregnancies and 0 surviving heirs, which is the saddest statistic in royal history. But even outside of Anne's bad luck, England's royal children had it rough. Edward VI, as we said earlier, barely made it to his teens. Henry VIII's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, grew up in fear of execution or exile, depending on which way their father's marital drama was blowing. Their childhood games included avoiding court politics and praying their heads stayed. Attached, and the Stuarts, Charles II's children were scattered by civil war. Some died in exile, others languished in prison, and those who survived grew up traumatized. Not exactly a wholesome upbringing, but perhaps the most famous tragic royal. Child of all time is Louis XVII of France, the lost Dauphin. He was the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, born in 1785. During the French Revolution, his parents were arrested, and after they were executed, little Louis, age 8, was locked in a cell in the Temple prison. There he wasted away. Alone, neglected, abused, reportedly kept in filth. By the time he died at age 10, his body was so ravaged by disease and malnutrition that the autopsy revealed his lungs rotted with tubercles. And yet, for decades afterward, imposters kept popping up claiming to be the real Louis XVI who had escaped. It became a whole cottage industry of fake dauphins. But the tragic truth was that the boy king had died forgotten in a prison cell, while his sister survived and lived to tell the story. Now, not every royal child died young. Some survived, but lived in ways so overprotected or overindulged that adulthood became impossible. Take Wilhelm II of Germany, the last Kaiser. As a baby, he suffered a botched delivery that left his left arm withered and useless. His mother, Princess Victoria, daughter of Queen Victoria, never forgave him for being less than perfect. She treated him coldly, criticized him constantly, and pushed him to hide his disability. The result, Wilhelm grew up insecure, neurotic, and desperate to prove himself, which did not end well for Europe in 1914. So yes, sometimes a single child's medical misfortune can snowball into world wars. No pressure, Wilhelm. Over in Russia again, the daughters of Nicholas II and Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia lived relatively sheltered lives. But because their brother Alexei was so fragile, the girls were basically reduced to supporting roles. They grew up in near isolation, treated more like a collective unit, the Ottoman sisters, than as individuals. Their childhood was one of etiquette lessons, prayers, and long hours of boredom inside palace walls. Not tragic in the sense of illness, but tragic in how limited their world was. Of course, we know how it ended in 1918 when their adolescence ended in the basement of the Ipatiev house. But even before that, their lives were strangely sad, muted, and confined. So, when we look at royal childhoods across history, a pattern emerges. Half of them didn't survive infancy. Those who did often grew up fragile, overprotected, or traumatized, and even the lucky survivors were rarely allowed to just be children. It's one of those ironies of monarchy. You could be born in a palace, surrounded by gold, dressed in silk, and still cough your way to an early grave, or live a life so suffocating you envied the peasants playing freely outside. And now, with that soft and melancholy thought, let's float onward again. Because while royal children had it rough, there's an even darker corner of history. The scandals of royal marriages, affairs, betrayals, and the occasional queen, who, yes, did in fact sleep with her stepsons, which is exactly where we began. Tonight, with Fredegund. And soon, we'll loop back to more of those dysfunctional medieval power couples who turned dynastic politics into soap operas. But for now, just breathe. The sad lullaby of royal nurseries fades into the quiet. Dysfunctional royal marriages, all right. So far, we've had sickly heirs, doomed children, and mystics who really needed a bar of soap. But nothing says royal history quite like a truly awful marriage. Royal weddings were rarely about love. They were about politics, alliances, and, let's be honest, keeping the Habsburg gene pool about as fresh as a glass of milk left out in July, which meant couples were often mismatched, miserable, and occasionally murderous. So let's tuck ourselves in and wander through a few of the worst royal marriages. We'll start with Henry VIII, because obviously, the man basically turned marital dysfunction into a full-time job. 6 wives, 2 executed, 2 annulled, 1 dead in childbirth, and 1 who somehow survived him. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, actually began as his brother's widow. Yes, married to Arthur first, then recycled to Henry like a dynastic hand-me-down. Their marriage lasted 24 years, but when Catherine failed to give him a surviving son, Henry pulled the "my conscience hurts" card and demanded an annulment. That little marital spat spiraled into the English Reformation. Entire monasteries dissolved, thousands of monks displaced, all because Henry wanted to dump Catherine for Anne Boleyn. Honestly, that's commitment to pettiness. And of course, when Anne herself produced only a daughter, Elizabeth, Henry had her executed for adultery, witchcraft, and treason, which in Tudor code meant she annoyed me. So yes, if you're keeping score, Henry VIII managed to destabilize religion in England, alienate the Pope, and rack up 2 decapitated wives, all while complaining about back pain and indigestion. A real catch. But let's drift back to medieval France, where the marriage of Philip IV's daughter Isabella to Edward II of England proved equally disastrous. Isabella became known as the she-wolf of France, which is never the nickname you want from history. She married Edward at age 12, and from the beginning it was clear he wasn't all that interested. Edward's heart, and most of his time, belonged to his male favourites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Isabella was humiliated. She was sidelined, and eventually she said, "Fine, if you won't love me, I'll overthrow you," which she did. In 1326, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded England, toppled Edward, and probably arranged for him to be murdered in prison. Not exactly a romantic fairy tale. Unless you're into political coups as love language. Of course, sometimes royal marriages were less violent, more just painfully awkward. Take Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Married in 1770, they were a teenage power couple in theory, but in reality, they spent 7 years failing to consummate the marriage. 7 years. Louis was shy, awkward, and possibly dealing with a mild medical condition. Marie Antoinette was young, frivolous, and more interested in parties and fashion than her confused husband. The gossip at Versailles was merciless. Pamphlets circulated with explicit cartoons mocking the royal couple. Eventually, after medical advice and maybe a stern talking to from Marie's brother Joseph II, things were sorted out. They had children, but by then the damage to their reputations was done. France laughed at them, and when the revolution came, nobody forgot those early jokes about the impotent king. Then we have poor Juana of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. She married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, who, as we noted before, was handsome in the questionable Habsburg jaw sense. Juana, however, adored him. Tragically, Philip did not return the favor. He cheated constantly, flaunted mistresses, and treated Juana with contempt. Her response: jealous rages, screaming fits, and clinging devotion that only made him pull further away. When he died suddenly at 28, Juana refused to part with his body. She supposedly carried his coffin across Castile, opening it to kiss the corpse. Was she truly mad, or just pushed to the edge by a miserable marriage? Hard to say. But history stamped her with the crazy label, while Philip got to keep his flattering nickname. Let's not forget Christian VII of Denmark and his wife Caroline Matilda. Christian was mentally unstable, prone to wild fits, self-harm, and erratic behavior. Their marriage was doomed from the start. Caroline eventually found solace in Johann Struensee, the king's physician. Together, Caroline and Struensee essentially ran Denmark for a time, passing reforms, modernizing laws, and trying to keep the king occupied with puppet shows. Eventually, though the court turned against them, Struensee was executed, Caroline was exiled, and Christian was left a broken figurehead. A royal marriage that turned into a tragic love triangle with the Doctor, And because no list is complete without the Habsburgs, Franz Joseph of Austria and Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. On paper, they looked perfect. Handsome emperor, beautiful empress. In reality, it was miserable. Franz Joseph was dutiful but cold, while Sisi hated court life, hated the Austrian bureaucracy, and spent much of her marriage running away on long trips. She obsessed over her beauty, dieted herself into frailty, and avoided her husband whenever possible. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, grew up lonely and eventually died in a murder-suicide at Meierling with his teenage mistress. Not exactly a heartwarming family portrait. So what do all these marriages have in common? They were arranged for politics, not affection. They left at least one partner miserable or dead, and they usually dragged entire countries into chaos along with them. Royalty might have had golden beds and jeweled crowns, but happy marriages? Not so much. And with that soft little reflection, we'll float onward again. Because royal marriages weren't just dysfunctional, they were often dangerous. And sometimes the fallout was war, rebellion, or dynasties collapsing entirely. But before we wander there, let's take a slow breath. The flicker of candlelight fades, the wedding bells go quiet, and all that's left is the sound of another royal couple sighing in disappointment. The last gasps of dysfunction. 19th and 20th century royals. By the 1800s, Europe was changing fast. Revolutions, industrialization, nationalism, all those big world-shifting things. And yet the royals, still trapped in the same cycles of bad marriages, fragile children, and dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own inbreeding charts. It's almost comforting in a strange way. The world modernized, but royal dysfunction remained timeless. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because obviously they were still clinging to their empire, still clutching their family trees like a security blanket. And yet they couldn't stop tripping over their own genetic knots. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, yes, the guy whose assassination in 1914 kicked off World War I, was a walking scandal before he ever walked into Sarajevo. He fell in love with Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess, which, by Habsburg standards, was basically the equivalent of marrying the maid. She wasn't royal enough. His uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, fought tooth and nail against the match. Eventually, Franz Ferdinand wore him down, but the marriage was declared morganatic, meaning Sophie could marry him, but she wouldn't be empress, and their children were barred from inheriting the throne. So, imagine your wedding day being half romance, half humiliation. Their children were essentially written out of the dynasty from the start. And then, of course, Franz and Sophie were assassinated together in 1914, which ended not just their marriage, but also millions of lives in the Great War. All because the Habsburgs couldn't handle marrying beneath their station. Meanwhile, over in Britain, Queen Victoria was busy turning marriage into an international export. She had 9 children, and she married them off across Europe like little chess pieces. On paper, it looked like a triumph. She was called the grandmother of Europe. In reality, she was spreading hemophilia across multiple dynasties like a party favor. Her son Leopold had the disease and died young from it. Her daughters carried it into the Spanish and Russian royal families. Tsarevich Alexei, the son of Nicholas II, inherited it, leading directly to the Rasputin fiasco we drifted through earlier. So thanks to Victoria's matchmaking, half of Europe's royal houses were quietly bleeding into early graves. That's one way to leave a legacy. Victoria herself, of course, had a famously devoted marriage to Prince Albert, but even that came with dysfunction. Albert was controlling, moralizing, and constantly criticizing their children. Victoria, meanwhile, was prone to deep depressions, especially after Albert died. She mourned him obsessively for 40 years, draping everything in black and effectively withdrawing from her role as monarch. Her children grew up under the shadow of that suffocating grief. Edward VII, her eldest son, spent his youth being berated for not measuring up to Albert. He responded by throwing himself into gambling, mistresses, and heavy dinners. When he finally became king at nearly 60, he was jovial but already wheezing with cigars and gout. So yes, even the model royal marriage of the 19th century left its kids scarred. Across the Channel, the Bourbons of Spain were still having a rough time. King Alfonso XIII managed to marry twice, both times to his cousins, because apparently Spain didn't get the memo about genetic roulette. His first wife, Maria de las Mercedes, died of typhoid just months after their wedding. Alfonso, devastated, promptly married another cousin, Maria Cristina of Austria. Their marriage was cold, formal, and political. Alfonso himself died at 27 of tuberculosis, leaving his pregnant widow to rule as regent. The child she gave birth to was Alfonso III, who would grow up spoiled, reckless, and politically disastrous. He meddled constantly in government, made a mess of Spain's politics, and supported Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. Eventually, the monarchy collapsed, and Alfonso died in exile. So yes, even in the supposed modern age, royal marriages were still producing instability and exile. And then, of course, there's the Romanovs again. Nicholas II and Alexandra might be the poster children of dysfunctional royal marriage in the 20th century. On one hand, they loved each other deeply, which sounds sweet. On the other hand, their devotion was so intense it blinded them to reality. Alexandra distrusted the Russian court, clung desperately to her sickly son, and put her faith in Rasputin. Nicholas, meanwhile, was indecisive, weak-willed, and far more comfortable at home with his family than dealing with his collapsing empire. The result? A dynasty that unraveled spectacularly. Their marriage was a love story, yes, but one that helped doom the Russian monarchy. Moving into the mid-20th century, monarchy was already in retreat. But that didn't stop the dysfunction from making headlines. Take Edward VIII of Britain, who gave up the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. On paper, that sounds romantic. In reality, it was messy. Wallis wasn't particularly popular. Edward was stubborn, immature, and frankly, a bit dull. Together, they became bitter exiles, drifting through Europe, occasionally flirting with fascism and resenting the royal family that had cast them out. Their marriage lasted, yes, but it was sustained by dependency more than affection. Edward had abandoned his crown, his country, and his duty, and in return got decades of golf, socialite parties, and awkward Nazi associations. Not exactly a happy ending. By now, monarchy was more soap opera than state power, which brings us inevitably to Charles and Diana. Their 1981 wedding was billed as a fairy tale, watched by millions. But within the marriage, a disaster. Charles never stopped loving Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana was young, vulnerable, and thrown into a hostile palace machine. The result was affairs, interviews, accusations, and one of the most spectacular royal divorces in history. Diana herself summed it up best. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The fallout nearly destroyed the British monarchy's image. Even today, it lingers. Dysfunction doesn't just disappear when the cameras turn off. So what do we see in these last chapters of royal history? The same old cycles of bad matches, meddling parents, and genetic gambles, marriages that destroyed empires, children scarred by the expectations of crowns, and, by the 20th century, royals reduced to celebrity scandals rather than rulers. In a way, the dysfunction became their last true power, keeping the public endlessly fascinated, even as their crowns lost their shine. And now, with that soft sigh of history, we've drifted from Merovingian murder queens all the way to Diana's doomed fairy tale. A tapestry of royal lives that were gilded on the outside, but fragile, flawed, and very human beneath the crowns. It's almost comforting. Kings, queens, emperors, and empresses, they worried about heirs, marriages, illnesses, and scandals, just like everyone else. Only their mistakes tended to drag entire nations down with them. So, as you let your eyes grow heavy, remember, even the people in golden palaces were often sad, sickly, spoiled, and spectacularly dysfunctional, which makes history less about thrones and battles and more about people being, well, people. And with that, good night.